Hey, First Grapevine, I'm Pastor Carly and this is Pastor Grant. We're excited to join you for a new series called What's Our Story? This month in our worship, we're talking about the stories and parables that Jesus told and recognizing that Jesus tells those stories for a reason, but also we have a story to tell. And so we're going to do a little mini series where we ask ourselves, what's our story? What's the story of who we are as First Grapevine, as Methodists, as Christians? And so I've got Pastor Grant here with us today, and he's going to tell us a little bit about the story of Christianity. So Grant, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Good. Haven't seen you in a long time.
I know. We're in a different place, too. I really like this.
Yeah, it's fun.
Yeah.
So could you kind of explain, if someone was new to Christianity, what's the basic story of how it got to be how it is, right? How it is now. How did it come to be?
See, I love this question because right now in our sermon series and everything else we're doing, we're talking about the stories of Jesus. Mm-hmm. But if you just look at the who, what, when, where, all of the stories of Jesus take place in a really small rural area. Very rarely does he even go to Jerusalem, the major city in the whole area. And even think of a global perspective, Jerusalem at this time wasn't that big of a deal. Mm-hmm. And so going there doesn't really matter. So how does the story of this guy spread to take over the whole world? Because now, if you're just approaching this fresh, you're like, okay, Jewish carpenter in the Roman Empire, and now I can't throw a rock in any town and not hit a church? How do we go from A to B?
Yeah, it's a pretty. There are two extremes there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the first step is we see the book of Acts. I won't just talk about that. That's kind of a cheesy answer to the question, right? The story of the church is the story of the Acts of the Apostles. But we see the book of Acts as here are the disciples who had lived with Jesus, who were here the whole time. And they take his message and they go out there. Mm-hmm. Can I just make a note? And you can edit this out if you want, if you have time. But it's just, we kind of have to giggle a little bit because we have such an amazing sound crew for everything that we do, video, sound, that the AC kicked on. And then everyone behind camera scrambled to try to get it to stop and shut the door and make it work. So I love having our backup support team, and they do an amazing job. But we see the book of Acts, we see the disciples, and then this growing crowd of people go from Jerusalem, from Israel, and just start spreading out.
And it's interesting too because you see after Jesus is crucified, Jesus has these followers, and then when he's crucified, when he's killed, they kind of scatter for a little while. And so it's almost like you're starting from ground zero again.
Well, what they were doing was basically declared illegal. So Christianity was illegal. The disciples are on the run. But yet they continue to, as you said, they go underground for a moment. And then it spreads like wildfire. And there are some factors that I wanted to talk to you about that really made that
Tell
possible.
me about them then.
Well, first of all, good news spreads. This is a message of hope. Because what I think is very distinct about the Christian story is that grace that's offered to everyone. So Jesus' disciples were normal people. They're women, which was really countercultural.
Yeah.
We say that, but a lot of times I think we take that for granted, especially if you're brand new to this. This was Jesus giving authority to women, the early church giving authority to women, Jesus' disciples being blue-collar workers. That was really countercultural at the time, still sort of is today even, and that had an impact on people. And so Christianity was the religion of the common people. Because
it could have easily been, well, why would we trust these people? They're nobodies. But it has the opposite effect of, they're people like us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one way that played out in the Roman Empire was the early believers were kind of got this reputation of being like a death cult or something. Because in the Roman world, whenever somebody died, if they weren't of importance, if they didn't deserve a wealthy funeral, then their body was just thrown out. But members of the church believing that God's grace is for everybody, God loves everyone, and every life is sacred, they would go and bury these bodies the best that they could. And so people were saying, why do they do this? What are they doing with these dead bodies, right?
Yeah.
But it was because they were showing respect. And that word of respect and that hope and that love, it spread by the way that they treated the corpses of perfect strangers. And so that was one thing, just one example.
That's incredible.
Of, like, Christianity spread because of the common people. And the other thing that is interesting to me historically, if you look at why does the church grow so quickly, it was the Roman road structure. Because if Jesus had come about, and if the early church had started, say, during the Babylonian occupation, which is just a different empire, empires rise and fall. Rome just happened to be the background of the New Testament. What if it had been Persia, Babylon, the Assyrians? They had other technological strengths, other feats, other things that they did, the impact that they had on the world. Romans built roads. If you travel, say, to that part of the world today, you travel to Israel, Greece, of course, obviously, Italy, you can still see, like, that's literally the road that existed at this time. They were so good at it. That's such a good network. Travel was, because of the roads, now available, accessible. People could take this good news, this message, and travel with it, go places.
That's really helpful to hear. And so it starts out as something very small, and just over time it continues to spread, and then until you've got what you have now, which is church on every corner, in a lot of places in the U.S. and then in other places in the world. So what are some of the ways, that's 2,000 years, a span of 2,000 years, what are some of the ways that Christianity has changed, or some of the ways that we've seen it shift over time?
Well, the earliest change that I think the church and people who follow Jesus still wrestle with is that basically overnight, due to Constantine, the Roman emperor, the church went from being illegal underground religion that was most of the time tolerated, sometimes directly persecuted, like in the 130s, for example. But then you get to the 300s and you see Constantine comes along, and overnight it goes from this is not allowed to this is the official religion of the entire empire. And so you have bishops and church leaders who have been in hiding are now given important public recognition. And that switch to going from being the religion of the common people to the religion of the powerful was at times very helpful. That led to, say, like the Bible being put together, like 66 books in the Bible, was a long process that Rome, again, these super organizers who built roads and did all this, said, all right, if this is our official religion, we got to get everything together. And so that's good. That's a good thing. But there's also the downside of then we see, at times in history, the religion is no longer about Jesus and God's grace, but it's about using it as a weapon.
Yeah, it goes through these waves of people being super spiritual and it being a very central part of society, and then kind of being used for ill will and things like that. Yeah,
I would say that gets a lot of attention, a lot of headlines when people think about Christianity, the negative. But the reality is it's horrible and it's bad and it should be recognized. That's a very small percentage of activities of the church over 2,000 years. Mostly the church has been about, again, preaching good news of Jesus for everyone and trying to live that out in some way or another. And that's always every era of the church. Even today we still wrestle with this idea of separation of church and state on a different continent 2,000 years later. So it's not an easy thing to deal with. It's not just one simple solution. That's just we're people, but God's creatures created to come and do a thing. It's not going to be perfect. All right, but we're working at it with God's grace.
I think that's a good point, not to take it as this is all good or this is all bad, but there are nuances, and we are working on it. And so to take that and wrestle with that is not a bad thing. It's a good thing if Christianity means something to you personally, to let that sit and to research that and to wrestle with that. So you mentioned putting the Bible together. Mm-hmm. Okay, we've got Bibles in our hotel rooms. We've got Bibles in our churches, obviously. It's this book. We think of it as one book, but it's really got 66 little books in it. How did that come to be? You kind of mentioned that, but could you go into a little more detail?
Well, without trying to get too nerdy, because it's really detailed. It's a long process.
Yeah.
And I think that speaks to the strength of the effort and the strength of where the church was at that time. Again, going back to, that's one of the first things that as Rome is officially, legally embracing Christianity, it's one of the first things they want to do was say, okay, you've got a lot of writings here that you're using, and already there is this development, even before that, of some books have more authority to speak on God's behalf than others. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of them being used. Mm-hmm. And so they began this process of saying, what really claims to be speaking on behalf of God? Who wrote it? Like, can we prove some authorship? They weren't trying to do like we would today. Like, we need your social security number.
Yeah.
We need your address. We need to talk to your relatives. But do we have an idea of how this book was created? It wasn't just written in a closet by somebody who wanted to claim to speak for God. Mm-hmm. And does it align with, does it claim for itself that it's Holy Scripture? Does it, can we sort of prove where this came from, roughly? Mm-hmm. And also, does it align with other teachings of the faith? Like, is it all orthodox?
Yeah.
Or does this book come out of left field and say something crazy?
Because there are gospels, stories from people about Jesus that are way off way different than we've ever heard. Yeah. And we don't see them in our Bible.
Yeah. So there's, and again, kind of varying degrees of this, and don't want to get too far in the weeds.
Yeah.
But even if you read something that is called like apocryphal, meaning that it's extra
apocryphal.
Yeah.
From the Apocrypha.
So, yes.
Okay. Say that 3 times fast.
I'd rather not. I can't. I don't think. But even as you read something like that, you can see, yes, this has some elements in it that are good for teaching, maybe understanding a little bit more about where people were coming from during this time period. But you can also definitely see why the church came to this conclusion that, if we're going to put our hand on this thing and say this really is God-breathed, then we want to hold it to a higher standard.
Mm-hmm. That's helpful. And so a lot of what we believe...
Can I just add one more thing?
I guess.
For the person for the one person, Charles DeMack, for you, my friend. I just mentioned him because he comes to a lot of Bible studies, takes great notes.
He does take good notes.
Takes great notes. He went with us to Israel last year. The word to look up is canonization. Mm-hmm. So the canon of the Bible, like this is what's in, that's what's out. So if you want to look up that whole process, the canonization of the Bible, it's very interesting. Or come talk to me and I'll give you big books to read. But I just had to throw that word in there so you know what to tell Google to find out more stuff. So Christians use the Bible as a primary text for this is our story. This is who we are. What are some of the core components of the Christian identity? Like if someone said you're a Christian, like who does that make you? What do you believe? Who are you? What do you do? What would you say? And I know that's a broad question, so you can kind of take that. I like that question. And so the early church had to address that, had to find a way to address it. Mm-hmm. And that's where you see, like if you go to a traditional church, you might at some point in the service be expected to stand up with everyone else and then say something in unison that is either printed on the bulletin that they give you or it's up on a screen somewhere. Or if you go to a really hardcore church, they don't give you any of that. And you still got to stand up and say it. And you got to know, if you're saying the Apostles' Creed, do we say debtors? Which terms are we using in this? So the Apostles' Creed that's another thing to look up. Mm-hmm. That was that's really the earliest example of the church saying, look, here's kind of the basic gutters of our faith. And you'll notice if you read it, I believe in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. Mm-hmm. It's not detailed. It's just sort of, here's some basic guidelines that we all follow. Mm-hmm. And so it was, for us, now unfortunately it's just kind of an element to traditional worship. And it is nice. It does feel good to stand up with a body of people and say, this is who we are. And to remind it for yourself and to do that in unison. But historically, that was used to teach new people. Mm-hmm. And they memorized it, just like a lot of us do today, so they would better understand what they were buying into.
Well, if you think about our students who go through a confirmation as they're preparing to become members of the church, they go through the Apostles' Creed, and so it's still taught as this is who we are. Yeah. So that's what you believe, but what do you do as a Christian? What does your life actually look like?
What does your life actually look like? Yeah, because that's really where the story happens. Because I referenced, whenever we started this conversation, the book of Acts. Mm-hmm. And one thing that seems remarkable to me about that is that this early, the early life of the church didn't take place in church as we would think of it.
Yeah, they didn't have church as we would think about it.
Church buildings, in fact, but they did have worship gatherings, but that's barely mentioned in this entire book. Mm-hmm. The book of Acts, the life of the church takes place outside, where they're meeting people in the marketplace, they're helping one another, they're traveling together. I read the book of Acts and I think a lot about how much fun they're having behind the scenes, because there's so many characters mentioned, which I love. It's not just, here's the acts of one person.
It's the acts of the apostles.
Group, like all these people. And I think the way your life looks is, by God's grace, a little bit more joyful, a little bit more purposeful. I think about people, they're just remarkable to be around. Like it's hard to define as just one thing, although there are lots of things in terms of my grandfather. Again, he worked in forestry, very simple person. He would plant like 200 tomato plants, so he could have 200, all right? So he could give those away to people in his community who were hungry. He was a one-man food bank. And he didn't make a big deal about it, but just, all right, Jesus says to love your neighbor. My neighbor is hungry. I can grow tomato plants and other things. Yeah. Or my mentor that I've mentioned a lot, who helped us with the Jesus Project, his name was Dr. Jim Pledger. He took another job in a church where I met him, because he just felt called to keep serving, even though he was retired, even as his health began to fail. He felt so much joy and purpose in being around the life of the church and doing his best to share what he had learned over the years. I think your life becomes different, but it's still very normal.
Yeah, it's expressed in unassuming ways.
Expressed in unassuming ways. I like that, because I think that's definitely true. But to me, it's that unmistakable joy, no matter that peace that passes all understanding. Meaning, one of the, I don't want to say difficult, but it's not the easiest part of our job, is that we have the privilege of being with people as they pass from this life to the next. And to be there with someone who has a strong faith and is really assured of God's love and presence with them, doesn't matter how much they hurt. It doesn't matter what's going on. Now, I've been with someone when they received a terminal diagnosis. It was someone I really looked up to. And his first comment was, I want to see my grandkids grow up. This is not right. But within 30 minutes, he just had that sense of peace. Mm-hmm. He goes, I don't like this at all, but I know where I'm going after this. And I know that it's always about those grandkids. Yeah. I know they're in God's hands. Mm. And so Christianity doesn't make life easier. In fact, one could argue it makes life harder. But it definitely makes those hard times very good and very meaningful.
That's great.
Is that an answer? I wasn't prepared for that. I was prepared for all the history stuff, but then you pull out like, how does it make your life better? That's good.
No, that's a hard question, and I think that's the question that makes what your story is unique. And so those different ways that you are experiencing joy and experiencing God's presence is what makes you. And so thanks for tuning in wherever you're watching or listening. And thanks, Grant, for being our first guest on our little series here.
Well, thanks for having me. This is really fun.
Yeah. So that's just that's a lot of information, but we know that's just a small amount of information in terms of the questions you may have or other stuff that we didn't cover. So feel free to reach out to us. You can find our emails on the website. Or just email the church and we'll figure it out and we'll get the questions to us. But thanks.
All the church. Yeah. We've got people answering the phone.
Yeah.
Like, I need to talk to this Grant character about nerdy things. Yeah, they will get you in touch with me.
Yeah. So thanks for joining us, and we hope you have a great day.